All right, welcome back to the Daily Fantasy Flex podcast. This is Bryan. I'm here. It's Tuesday afternoon. I'm here with Colin Davey, Peter Jennings. That means we're talking PGA, and it's Masters week, guys. You guys excited? Colin, what's up, man?
Hey, how's it going? And congratulations to beating both of us in the FantasyLabs league play last week. I came in dead last. I think Pete was second to last. So clearly that means you're running the show going forward. So I have to give props where props is due.
Yeah, I guess I can just mute y'all now.
Yeah, that's fine. We've earned that.
Pete, what's going on, man?
Oh, it's a beautiful week. And, last week was not the strongest showing in cash games by any stretch in PGA. But it's going to be a fun week this week, obviously, and just a great time in sports. So I'm pumped for it. And I've probably already listened to just 10, 15 hours of other podcasts, other stuff, just getting prepped for this. And it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really stoked for the Masters. Yeah,
Pete, how are you holding up this week? I mean, we got heavy MLB obviously starting, and NBA still going on, and now Masters week. This is a busy little time for you, I bet.
Absolutely, playing every slate of every sport right now, and the Masters is actually taking up a good chunk of that time, which is nice. I really enjoy the research for it, and I feel like this is a really compelling week. There's so many elite players in great form right now, and there's compelling storylines behind a lot of guys, and just golf's in a great place as a game. So I'm stoked for the Masters, and there's more volume in the Masters than any other week in golf. So it should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. We have a lot of big tournaments on DraftKings. Yeah, obviously a Millie Maker, but all sort of smaller tournaments with smaller entries as well. So definitely a great time to kind of get into our tools and get into daily fantasy golf for sure. It's just some quick show notes. We're actually going to do a live show, a live podcast tomorrow. It's going to be at 8:30. It's going to be, we're going to have a landing page on the site that we will get out to you guys tomorrow. So come join us at 8:30. We'll have a time for you guys to send in questions and do all that, and we'll answer as many as we can. We'll talk kind of last minute news, weather, all sort of things leading up to the Masters. So again, it's going to be 8:30 Eastern time tomorrow. Check the site, check our Twitter, and we'll get you information on that. Okay, guys, let's jump right in. So the Masters. Let's start with the course, which is obviously Augusta National. Probably the most famous golf course in the world. I'll give recent winners real quick and weather, and then we'll kind of jump right into talking about the course. Last year, Jordan Spieth won. Obviously, he was 18 under. The year before that was Bubba Watson at 8 under. Adam Scott the year before that, 9 under. Bubba took it again in 2012 at -10, or the first time rather. Took it again in 2014. And Schwartzel won in 2011 at -14. Weather doesn't look to be that much of a problem. It's going to be highish of 70, so pretty good weather. Some fairly strong wind, it looks like, but it's going to be even across the day, so not going to differentiate across the tee time. So let's get right into it, guys. Colin, I know you do your course fit. Tell us about Augusta National.
So the course fit, as far as key stats, and this has kind of been vindicated by a couple other articles people have done on the Masters in years past, is it's a bomber's course. Augusta gets a lot of reputation as, it's a slick green, so maybe you're thinking pick strong putters to handle those greens. But time and time again, the bombers come out rating like really high. I know Neil Payne at 538 did a similar analysis a couple of years ago as far as what types of playing stats are more predictive of success. It's definitely bombers, and the same is true here. And I guess the interesting thing that's coming up in my kind of course fit routine, and we talked a little bit about more this week, is I'm getting a slight bonus from people who have low driving accuracy. And this is kind of a concept that I'd love to explore in an article down the road. Does course fit make sense for, can you weight negative stats negatively? Can you give a boost to people with bad low scores? And I think we talked about a little bit of the last week with Houston Open. So Pete, you said last week, you didn't like Keegan Bradley because he couldn't make a putt to save his life, right? That's the knock on him. So when you're talking about course fit, hypothetically, what if you had a course that made everybody putt like Keegan Bradley? It stands to reason that Keegan Bradley would gain, right? Because the one thing he can't do well, that kind of downside is nullified, if on this hypothetical course, right? So if he gains in the abstract, you might, okay, so what stats become important? You might assume that everything else, like driving accuracy and driving distance, gets weighted positively. But if you have a course where like that has some kind of that effect, I don't think it's that insane to say that like bad stats can get weighted negatively, and that's the way the course fit pops. And I think we're seeing a similar things in Augusta here this year, where I'm looking at a couple comparatively similar players, someone like Justin Thomas and Keegan Bradley, actually. The difference is Justin Thomas has worse driving accuracy, and he's rating out a little bit higher on course fit. And I think it's because it's essentially saying you have like Thomas has worse driving accuracy, so we're going to give him a bonus for that. It's incredibly counterintuitive, but I don't think it's that insane that the data would pick up that way. And I think course fit is still kind of a new thing that people are figuring out in DFS. And that kind of negative weighting is something that I don't think anybody will do because it's so counterintuitive. So I wanted to throw it to you kind of with some subject matter expertise. Like, what do you think the merits of that approach are?
I think there's merits to it. I think par 5 scoring is really critical here. Most of the guys just tear up the par 5s. I think Phil Mickelson led it last year, shooting 15 under on the par 5. So makes sense with the Bombers and some of the shots. You can really shape your shots. And if you, for instance, like Bubba's had a ton of success here. He can hit a ton of fades, which is really, really, really nice for him. So they have wider ranges that they can hit, especially if they're really long hitters. Par 5 scoring is going to be huge for me here. The Masters more so than almost any other course. I'm wearing course history a ton. I think that the greens, there's a lot of subtleties that you can pick up over time with experience. And some of these guys just consistently putt really well at Augusta. So that's something else that I'm looking at. I think strokes gained putting is something that people are talking about, throughout the industry. And I'm actually buying into that this week. I definitely am looking at some strokes gained stuff. We'll talk about with some specific golfers, specific to putting. And specific to putting potentially at the Masters as well. So in terms of course history, the main things I'm looking at are the putting stats, the guys who are bombers, and the guys who can make eagles at these par 5s, because that's where the Masters is normally won. Tiger Woods had the record for it, I believe, shooting 16 under on the par 5s. And, a lot of guys can approach that, especially the guys that we're talking about at the top. You look at Rory, he can easily get to a lot of these greens and 2 with shorter clubs. Dustin, absolutely. Jason Day, absolutely. And that's really what's going to, win you, these fantasy contests is getting guys who can make a lot of eagles and birdies on these par 5s, because that's where, the most of the scoring comes from. So that's what I'm targeting, looking at putting quite a bit, and definitely weighting course history a lot more for golfers with Augusta, especially since we have some decent sample size in a lot of these guys.
So kind of before we move on to the stats and the player stuff, one question I had kind of regarding course history, and I guess maybe it has to do with course fit a little bit, is we obviously have star-studded cast here. It's the Masters. We have Jordan Spieth, trying to defend his title. Vegas odds favor is Jason Day, who obviously doesn't necessarily have the sort of history at Augusta as some of these other guys. The guys all around him, as far as the Vegas odds, all have either placed really high or even won when when you're talking about Jordan and Bubba and Adam Scott and Phil down just a little bit lower. So why do you guys think that Jason Day is the favorite for Vegas right now?
Jason Day tops out in kind of my ratings as well right now. And I think it's just that it's not all that complicated. His overall game is strong enough right now that, it's really good. He matches the course fit really well. He has the distance and kind of grades out on all the key metrics. I kind of look at it as a hypothetical of like, yes, you can decide that course history is important, but how good would someone have to play going into the Masters, even if they haven't played it like more than twice, to be a prohibitive favorite? It's not an impossible scenario. Like you could like literally win every tournament, and then you'd probably still like running up to the Masters and still call them the favorite. So that's just kind of the question you have to answer. How good do you think they have to play and only have 2 course history like sample sizes to like be considered the favorite? And in my mind, he's done enough.
He's easily the favorite, and he's going to be one of the heaviest owned, if not the most heavily owned player in the tournament. Bryan, I know you mentioned he doesn't have quite as good a course history, but he still has pretty strong. In 2011, he tied for second. 2013, he got third. His most recent 2 years haven't been as good, but again, he was dealing with a lot of health issues. And he's really turned himself into a totally different player now that he's past all that. And he's clearly the number one player in the world. And you look at a lot of the stats that help him. His scrambling has been incredible. His putting has really changed and really been great. And all the stuff, that he's always been great at, driving distance and just being able to hit, these really, really high, long shots. I mean, he's as talented as anyone out there. It makes sense that, he's really found his game, and, he's number one in the world. When the pricing originally came out, he didn't have 2 wins recently. So, he wasn't as favored as Spieth and Rory, and now he is. So you get all this. You get a discounted price for the favorite, and he's in great current form. So recency bias is checked off for all the people. And, it's tough for me. I'm trying to figure out how to handle someone like him with all these other studs, just because I do think he's playing great. I think there's a lot of things that are pointing to him, doing extremely well. And, he's probably the most likely guy to win the Masters, which is why the odds are that way. So it's a tough challenge, and it definitely makes sense to me why he's the favorite and will be the chalkiest play on DraftKings this week.
Yeah, one thing I really wanted to emphasize that you kind of mentioned in passing, for those that forgot, DraftKings released their Masters prices like 3 weeks before the event. So this is one of the few events in PGA or on PGA DFS where there are events that are not priced in. Because they set them so far back that there are recent results that you need to account for them, and no, they're not priced in, and you can capitalize on that.
Cool. So one thing that Pete, that you just mentioned, and it's kind of an ongoing debate between you guys, is the long-term stats versus recent form and the mental game of golf, and kind of what matters. And obviously, the Masters is it's the biggest golf tournament in the world, and these guys are facing enormous pressure. So I kind of just want to dive into that and let you guys kind of debate it out a little bit. And Pete, I'll start with you. How important do you think that mental game is, recent form, guys feeling confident about how they are and where their game is right now going into the tournament?
I mean, I think it's important. I think it differs based on the golfer. One thing that is just, obvious is all these guys have done and made decisions to gear up for this event. I mean, Jason Day talked about his 2 goals in life or in golf are to be number one in the world and to win the Masters. Rory said he's doing everything this year, and his number one focus is Augusta. You hear everyone talk about, I mean, this is the Super Bowl of golf, and they're all trying to, make their game as good as possible before the Masters. I mean, Phil played last week because, he's won every time he's won the Masters, he played the week before. He talked about how critical that is to his process. So, I mean, I think everyone's trying to be in the best place possible to really get their game peaking for this event, because this is the event they want to win the most. And there's a lot of things that you have to wait. Some of these guys come in with, terrible form like Justin Rose did last year, and they still know the course so well, and they can find it, and they can kind of, raise their game and really focus for this specific event, especially, if they're coming off an injury or whatever. They're going to give their all for this. So I know there's a lot of subjective things in that statement overall, but I definitely think it matters. And, these are humans out there playing. So it's one of those weeks where I really value a lot of these narratives. And I know that goes against what Colin in general thinks. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of interesting discussions on particular golfers.
Yeah, so Pete, let me play devil's advocate with a little bit of stuff in that statement, because I'm more trying to understand how that actually affects a decision process from a practical standpoint. So I agree that everybody gears up for majors and they're trying to win, right? I guess I'm trying to figure out I'm approaching this kind of from a one size fits all. How does data generally tell a story? Who would you pick differently if you know that they're really trying to win versus someone you don't think is trying to win? Because I'm kind of assuming that over the regular season, everybody's trying to win all the time. But this idea that, I'm going to try extra hard this time is going to lead to some magical 10-stroke differential. I kind of that's my skepticism. So who do you think, can you give an example of someone who you think may not be trying as hard in the regular season, so to speak, but tries extra hard in the Masters, and that's warranted by he will in fact do better?
See, I should have phrased it different. I don't like trying as hard is not necessarily the right. I think that golfers will make decisions to try to peak.
Okay, but that's same thing. Like optimizing their performance around the Masters, opposed to all right. So who specifically is a player where it's like, maybe like when they played like Houston or Pebble Beach or whatever those, they're kind of going in with 80%, like they're sacrificing performance there.
I think there's things that. So first, a lot of these guys aren't going to withdraw, right? That's one thing that like someone like Louis Oosthuizen is a guy that comes to mind off the bat. Like he was dealing with a back injury in the past, and sometimes he wouldn't play certain tournaments, or he maybe would give in on a day 2 and he's not playing as well. And I think someone like that might get a small bump. The bigger circumstances and things I'm trying to identify is like Justin Rose last year is a perfect example. He was really coming in with bad form. He was probably trying to work on a variety of different things to really get his game, and he was probably taking certain risks. Maybe maybe he wouldn't hit driver on certain holes, but he was really trying to find his driver for the Masters, and he would do that when he's trying to get himself back into play. And then he finds himself essentially at the Masters last year after the bad form and the injury. So it's identifying guys who might be rounding into form. There's certain examples of guys where they've just played really well at the Masters in the past, like Sergio maybe this week. Has he been working on certain things? He didn't really play well last week to end at Shell Houston Open, but maybe he was working on things, and maybe he's really trying to peak this week at the Masters. So I agree with you. People, I don't think in general athletes try harder. The only argument I ever make for like people trying harder on a night-to-night basis might be the NBA, where it's just such a grinding schedule, and these players are relying so much on effort and athleticism, whereas most other sports, even baseball, hockey, golf, whatever, there's such a mental aspect of it, and I think everyone's always trying to win. It's just for this in particular tournament, I'm trying to identify guys who might not be in the best recent form, try to find a reason why, because I think they'll have lower ownership, and target them, especially in like million maker lineups. Justin Rose is the guy that I'm trying to find the Justin Rose of last year, essentially.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I think there is like in the abstract, I could like buy into the idea of if you're a top player and you're maybe taking more risks in quote unquote safe tournaments that aren't the Masters to try out new stuff. Like, yes, maybe you're taking more risks and you're trying stuff and your like data will show up that you're playing worse. I just don't know that I could reliably separate who's playing worse because they're consciously taking risks and experimenting versus who's just playing worse because they're not, like they're in bad form.
Right.
That's an eye test thing for sure. And even if you did watch it, like I think that's a really tough thing to do. Maybe you just do need to be like watching golf all the time and kind of consciously identifying who's a risk taker, like what maybe you pull in other information. But just from a data-driven perspective alone, I'm not confident in my ability to make that like fine line distinction. And I think it's dangerous to assume that like you can, because that way you get in the habit of ignoring data when you really don't have a good reason to.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you. And in general, I'm still going to, pick the guys that the data suggests, but I am more willing to look at someone. And I think a big thing is injuries. Like guys coming back from an injury, maybe they don't feel, just using an example, they don't feel as comfortable bringing the club as far back as they used to, or there's something in their hand they don't feel as comfortable with other clubs, but they know they need to have those clubs for Augusta. So maybe, the optimal shot at that time is like, okay, I can't do what I would normally do, but this is the safer thing, but I also need to work towards this. So maybe I'll risk it. And I know that's so subjective, almost impossible to identify, but I do think there's an overarching thing that we can take, especially from a game theory perspective. Try to identify golfers who, for whatever reason, maybe haven't played well recently, but might be, peaking or trying to find something to peak at the right time. And I think guys, especially who have had a lot of success in the Masters previously, are guys that we can look at for that. So Sergio is someone potentially that could be like that this year.
Yeah, and I think I wonder to what degree like something like course history would reflect and capture something like that, because like let's say like you're a Justin Rose case where like you're trying risks beforehand leading up to it, and like your overall rating like is down going into the Masters, and then you overperform because you're peaking at the right time. Like course history, I think if you capture it right, it's not just like what is your finishing position, but how much better did you do than expected, and that's what I try to work at, and I kind of capture numbers. I capture that. Maybe that'll be captured in course history to some degree. but course history is so noisy to begin with that it's how much can you usefully extract. So I don't know. I believe in the concept you're describing. I'm always trying to figure out how do you capture that with data, or how do you come up with a metric that identifies what you're talking about.
Right. And it's definitely right now I'm speculating and making subjective decisions. And in general, that's not how I want to do things. But for this week, there's a lot of storylines and there's just so much. And the one thing we can leverage, especially for the millionaire maker, is just what those storylines and the perception they're creating for others, because that's going to affect ownership, which is really, really important.
Ownership would be, we'll get into ownership a bit, but that's just something I don't have a great bearing on. And I think you're far more on top of that beat than I am.
Cool. Looks like Brian's coming back here in just a sec, but there's a variety of things that we'll be looking at with the course history specifically. Bryan, do you want to talk about a couple things, then we'll get into the tiers?
Oh yeah. Sorry. So just kind of on that last debate before we move on to the tiers, we had Rob Bolton, who is one of the fantasy golf writer for PGA Tour.com, and he was kind of talking about that sort of thing, like how do you figure out whether players are struggling or whether they're trying out stuff. And one thing that he mentioned is that in golf he gives a lot of weight to actual player interviews, whether it's media or just kind of talking around the course. And I think he even posited that in golf they're maybe a little more willing to be honest than in other sports. Do you have any thoughts about that, or is that potentially a way, like if a guy's going to be injured in golf or trying stuff out, do you think that you could look through some or listen to some interviews and try to figure it out that way?
Absolutely. That's stuff you can pick up on. Some of these guys will say, hey, I'm hurt. You heard that. I think one of the Asian guys is hurt. I remember hearing that.
Oh, Byung-Han An, I think. Yeah.
Said his back's hurt. And you just hear around. I mean, and that's the people who are really plugged in and really know these guys and are hanging around on the PGA Tour. They'll hear stuff. And, one other thing, just final thought on what we were talking about before, players are much more willing to go through like a swing change or try something during the beginning part of the year or away from a major. Players don't generally want to be going through some sort of swing change or new concept at the Masters. They're just going to do whatever they feel the most comfortable with. So that's just something you're trying to identify. Who's really feeling great about their swing? Who's not having to make these adjustments? Especially guys who are injured, you want to know about that. So definitely any little tidbits you can pick up on are really important. But all these guys too, mentally, they're probably not going to give away much because, they all want to win this tournament as much as possible, even if they're dealing with stuff. So you try to pick up on things that they're willing to tell. And I definitely think there's an edge to people who are really following closely and are in tune with just kind of the inner workings on the PGA Tour.
Cool. Good debate. Let's get into the players. Just so, because I think this is going to be probably the most valuable part of the pod, and we'll probably kind of wrap around to these discussions again when discussing individual players. And just because of the nature of this tournament, I definitely want to let us talk about players as much as possible, just because it is a big field, and want to make sure that we're kind of getting in all sorts of value mid guys and the elite ones. So let's go through the tiers like we normally do. And the tiers are as follows. It's the elite one is going to be 9,000 or more. The middle tier we're going to define as 7K to 8.9, and the lowest tier, the value tier, if you want to call it, is 6.9 or less on DraftKings. So, Colin, we'll start with you. You've obviously optimized your model. You've changed and weighted for this specific tournament. Of the elite guys, 9K or more, who's coming out the top of your model?
So I think the top three right now are, Jason Day, kind of no surprise there. He's the betting favorite, has a distance, is playing at an overall really well level. After that, I like Bubba Watson, just from a combination of course history, key stats. And then the third interesting one, and I go back, this is a good, debate for narratives, is Dustin Johnson. Because he is driving the ball better than anyone else on the tour right now. He has great. He had a third place finish last week. He has all of the metrics that say he's a good fit, and yet the knock on Dustin Johnson is he collapses at majors. And I believe in the abstract that's a really real thing, and that maybe that is the knock on him. But Pete, maybe you can answer this. At what point does would that narrative knock you down from what is otherwise I think a pretty cheap price for Dustin Johnson?
Well, I love Dustin Johnson this week. He's
okay. Like, oh damn! I was hoping we could argue over something.
No, he's one of my favorite plays, but I also like him for a reason that I hope maybe he can cause an argument. Last week, coming into Sunday, he was number one in strokes gained putting, and there's so many narratives that I'm buying into with Dustin. So, to go on a little bit of a rant here about Dustin, just in general, I think mentally he, at least over the last couple of years, might have been one of the worst golfers on tour. It's no secret his brother is his caddy, and a lot of people question if he's as good of a caddy as other caddies. And I certainly think that, in combination with Dustin's mental approach to the game, has certainly hurt him. We heard talk when Spieth and his caddy were playing with Dustin. I remember one of the announcers were talking about, if Dustin got to play with Spieth and his caddy, he'd win every tournament. And obviously he was joking, but there's so many things that Dustin can improve on from the mental aspect that I think he's actually really started to work on. They were talking a lot about it last week that he has been hitting with this thing in the range, and every time he hits his wedges, that tells him exactly how far his ball is traveling. So he's really trying to fine-tune his wedges. In addition to that, he's doing a lot more around the greens. He seems to be taking a lot more time, and he was putting really well last week at Shell Houston Open, where they really try to emulate Augusta with the speed of the greens and just how they work. So I like Dustin a ton. I think there's a lot of reasons to see him do really well. He's as good as anyone at making eagles on the tour. He's going to crush these par fives, and I love to see that his putter's coming into form and that he's really working on the short game, because he'll have a ton of wedge shots this week at Augusta. So I really, really like him, and the whole choking thing and all that stuff, I'm not going to really buy into that too much. I mean, it's such a small sample size for these guys at majors, and I do think a large part of why he probably didn't finish well at some of those things is just mental mistakes. And if he's really working on that and can resolve them, he's going to be as good of a play as anybody, because he's as gifted and talented a golfer. I said that about Jason Day too, but he's definitely the best athlete on the tour. He beat Shane Battier in a one-on-one game of basketball. He is an absolute freak of nature in terms of an athlete. So I like all the signs pointing to him. I like the mental stuff. He was close at every major last year, and I like where his game's at now too. Even in the match play, he made a ton of birdies in the match play and played really well there. So he's one of my favorite players, and you get him at a huge discount to some of these other guys. And I think the top tier, I'm kind of separating the top tier into two tiers, maybe even three. But the really top tier, the 10K plus guys, you can argue any one of them for a good reason. Bubba Watson has won recently twice in the last 4 years. He hits the ball mile. His game fits really well at Augusta. Ricky Fowler, I've heard a ton of people buzzing about him. He's playing probably the best overall golf of anyone week to week. You have Adam Scott, who won twice on the Florida Tour. Everyone's saying he's back. You have Spieth, obviously, last year, and you look at his numbers at the Masters alone, he has as good numbers as anyone. Obviously, he's on second and first in his 2 years at the Masters, and he's going to be a really popular pick. So there's a ton of guys. What are your thoughts on everyone else in that range? And do you have any guesses on ownership or just how you're going to attack it, Colin?
I think, if anything, Jason Day is going to be super highly owned. I think probably the highest. I agree with that, just because there's stuff that isn't priced in. He's playing the best right now. People are just going to look at the tournament favorite for fourth highest price, and it's going to be a no-brainer. He's definitely the highest owned. I think Dustin Johnson might actually be low owned for the reason we talk about. I think collapsing at majors is maybe a narrative that people would buy into otherwise and maybe avoid him. So I think even from a GPP perspective, he'd be fine.
What do you think, real quick, because I know it's a thing here. I know it's super small sample size, but one round, he was making 100 feet of putts a day. After the first 3 days, he was number one in strokes gained putting. And he's doing this new approach, the way he's kind of looking at putts and whatnot. Can you see yourself giving even a small uptick in value for someone like that?
Honestly, probably not. And the reason if there's one, other stats I could maybe buy into improvement on, but there is just so much literature out there. Jake Nichols, who's now at this place called, I think, 15th Hole, and doing kind of player-focused analytics. He has a whole thing on how changes in putting performance are by and large illusory, and every time that you think they carry over, they don't carry over nearly as much from week to week. So maybe so maybe if you identified something that truly has changed, you'd be okay, now he's self-putting now. But to me, I treat putting as kind of like a BABIP type of thing, where it has enormous week-to-week luck, And like anytime that you truly think there's a change of performance, I think there's too much randomness that I can't give a credit. I'm just that's the one word, like that's the hill I die on.
Right. And I get it. I totally understand. Of course, someone makes like a 60-foot putt. That's obviously going to skew their strokes gained putting tremendously. And just there's so much noise in that stat that I certainly understand. But for me, it's one of those small things where I will give a slight bump to Dustin, which I know is counterintuitive given that I just said that. But I do think, especially recent form, just the confidence, there's something about it that I just feel good about for Dustin. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe that's just one of those subjective things. My gut's telling me it matters, and it actually doesn't at all, because I certainly, from a data standpoint, understand that it's noisy and putting is very, lucky week to week. So, but it is one of those things that I'm taking into account, and I'm definitely valuing. And the same thing for Rory potentially as well, with the change of the putting grip that he's using. He apparently made a hole in one of his practice rounds and putted pretty well down the stretch in that, in the World Golf Championship match play event. And maybe I'm giving him a slight bump in that too, which I shouldn't. But those are just the differences, I guess, in how a lot of people think about it. And I certainly, I'm excited to learn more about the data and see how it plays out.
Yeah, and I guess kind of going down the rest of the list, I guess the next big three, Rory, Adam, and Jordan, they're fine. They're going to do well, but just I'm thinking cash game focused. I don't think well enough to justify how much more expensive they are than everyone else. They're all more expensive than Jason Day's, just in a strictly one-to-one matchup. I don't think they're doing enough. And I think they're the worst pure values among the top tier. Again, they'll do fine, but the only thing you'd be looking at them for now is ownership perspective. I would guess that. Do you think Rory's probably going to be the least owned because his price tag is so high?
I do. I think that all these other guys are getting so much buzz. And just from a salary perspective and a roster construction standpoint, Rory's the toughest one to fit. And that's so interesting because he is, again, it's just all these guys. That's why I think golf is in such a great place. You can make a really good argument for all these guys who are 10K plus. We haven't talked about Phil at all, who's, one of America's favorite golfers. And he's been playing incredibly well this year. Just hasn't, quite broken through for a win or anything, but everything's lining up. And talk about a guy who has just a ton of experience at Augusta, which I value. You can make a ton of arguments for him. What about the 9K to 10K range? I think there's some other really, really good plays, and definitely think there's some interesting tournament aspects of some of these guys. Who's rating well for you, Colin?
So the 9K, 10K guys, who do I like? Probably
there's only four guys there, and it's Matsuyama. Schwartz.
Yeah, so from a value, they're all kind of similarly bunched. From a value perspective, I think Matsuyama's probably still the top. Maybe that's just partly name recognition. He's not driving the ball as well, so course fit isn't great, but I still think 90, that the saving drop off from Justin Rose is pretty decent. I think Stenson is he may be a little bit of fool's gold actually this week. I know he has a second place finish. He is a great overall golfer, and I roster him in tons of other tournaments. But of those guys, I think he has the worst course fit for me. He's a ball striker. He doesn't have a whole lot of distance. I think you're better. I'm actually curious as far as what is ownership going to be, because maybe people think really top in OWGR, finish second. How is he so cheap? And I think his course fit is just that bad.
Right. So this is another one where I just think I pick up a good edge watching, and really there's some subtle stuff that I think is really important. I think for ownership, I definitely am going Charles over Stenson. And I think a lot of people will be on Stenson, and maybe he's a better cash game play than you and I think. But one thing about Stenson, just watching him over the last couple of weeks, he's been easily the best ball striker. He's number one in greens and regulation, I believe, over the last couple of weeks. And, that is important at Augusta. That's one thing we didn't talk too much about. But the one thing about Stenson is he's really uncomfortable with his driver, which lowers his driving distance. He hits his 3-wood off almost every single tee. I remember seeing a stat last week at Shell. It's he has only hit the fairway with his driver 24% of the time this year. And every single year over the last 3-4 years, he's used his driver less and less and less. He loves his 3-wood. He hits it 280. So he hits his 3-wood as far as most, the average PGA Tour guy hits their driver. and he hits it really accurately. So especially over the last couple of weeks, that's paid off. But here at Augusta, where I want those bombing shots where they can have these short irons into the green, I think he's a little bit overrated as well. And it won't surprise me if he does really well. He has relatively good history here. He's striking as well as anyone. And the argument that you can make against what I just said is, oh, well, there's no one better in golf right now with, the medium low to, like the 5 to 7 iron. He's striking as well as anybody, and he's great from that 180 to 200 yard range, which is true. But I think that Schwartzel's a much better play, and I think recent form on Stenson and just his name versus some of these other guys is going to make him much more heavily owned. Say someone like Schwartzel, who I think if you're playing the millionaire maker, I think Schwartzel over Stenson is a great pivot.
I agree with that completely. Just on ownership alone, and Schwartzel rates out maybe a little bit higher. Just
past winner too, which I value.
Yeah.
Pete, from a roster construction standpoint, obviously you have to fit in under the salary cap. Just kind of building your golfers here. Obviously, a lot of people are going to try to get those top name guys. Obviously, we have the guys that are 10K and up, and then there's some value down in the kind of the 8K range and below, which we'll get to in a second. Do you think that these guys in this 9? There's only 4 between 9 and 10K. Are going to be just kind of lower owned because people are either going to want to go up or go down?
I think Justin Rose will be low owned again, which is really interesting. He's a guy that I didn't talk about just there, but I think he's going to be lower owned because I think a lot of people who are in that range are going to figure out a way to bump up to Dustin or Mickelson, which I see a lot of people doing that. Definitely think Stenson and Schwartzel will be a little bit lower owned, but the thing is, if you build like a really balanced lineup and just take guys kind of in like the high 7s to 8s, you can kind of finish off your lineup with one of these 9K guys. So if you're building like that balanced team versus the stars and scrubs, I could easily see some people landing on Matsuyama, Schwartzel, Stenson. Definitely more Stenson, obviously, with ownership. But I do think they won't be super heavily owned relative to the top guys. I think we'll see like Jason Day and Ricky be more owned than these guys. But yeah, the real interesting debate is going to come in this next tier value. Matsuyama is the one guy that I wouldn't be shocked to see really heavily owned just with his name recognition and his price. But again, I could be wrong on that too. I'm not 100% sure how roster construction is going to lead people to making their lineups.
Yeah, always kind of an interesting thing to think about is, where are guys in relation to, their peers as far as pricing goes. So before we move on to the next thing, we talked about these guys that are 10K or more. I'm going to put you guys on the spot. Give me one of those golfers that you have to fade. Pete, I'll start with you.
That you have to fade 10K plus. The guy I'm probably most likely to fade right now is Jordan Spieth, which is just so scary considering he's gotten second and first. But I under the assumption that he's 30% owned or really heavily owned, the next highest owned versus Day, I would fade him in tournaments. And I know that may sound really foolish, and I'll probably be kicking myself for it, but he's been spraying his irons, and he's just not quite as sharp. The other thing, too, that just from watching him, is he seems to get really upset after every shot. And again, these are all super tiny subjective things, but it's like he already has that Tiger Woods type, like has to have perfection. And relative to these other guys like Scott, Day, even Bubba, they're just in such good form, and everything just screams winning out of these guys. So that's a really, really bad subjective answer, but I guess it'd be Spieth because there's no fading. I'm probably gonna have some exposure to all these guys. You can really make a good argument based on data, I think, for a lot of these guys. But curious to hear who Colin says out of these that he's most likely to fade.
Yeah, I mean, Spieth is I'm curious because I think we talked about it last week, like how bad does Spieth have to play in the run up to the Masters for people to fade him? And like your view is what, like he's inelastic to that kind of thing, right? It's still Spieth, it's still the Masters. People are going to pick him.
There's a stretch there last week where he made like 3 or 4 birdies in a row, whereas like he could easily win. And it would not. I mean, obviously he's Jordan Spieth. I mean, he was the best player last year, and I mean, look at his adjusted round average at Augusta. It's just ridiculous. I mean, he's
yeah,
so good.
I agree with that, but like I can't like again like that. I'm on your fade bandwagon too, which is like I just from a numbers perspective, like other people have higher distance, cheaper price, better overall form. Like yeah, it's maybe there's something just that the data is not capturing about him in Augusta, which like happens all the time. But I can talk myself into fade pretty easily. Kind of similar reason for like the other two like expensive guys, Adam Scott and Rory. I don't mind fading them at all. like if from a cash game perspective. Adam Scott, like I think his biggest improvements came with the putter. I know we talked about that early on. I'm more inclined to discount changes in putting because it's so noisy. And then Rory, I think like his biggest edge over the other top guys is normally like something like driving accuracy. If you look at our player models, is way higher than all those other top guys. But not only does that not count for much at Augusta, sometimes according to the data, apparently that can weight negatively against you. So it's just, I don't think his big edge translates well here at Augusta.
Interesting.
Cool. Let's move on. Let's go to the next tier of players, which again is going to be 7,000 to 8,900. People will roll with you first here. Who do your models, and even if your models don't like, maybe who you just like in this range?
Okay, I hate to do this. I know we've done this range, and we should continue to do it for every other tournament. But because we have such a finite amount of golfers here, and because I think that there's like this range in particular, there are so many viable guys. I'm going to go 8K to 9K first.
I like it. Yeah, do it.
There's so many players that in this range that are really enticing. I think Louis, again, is a guy that I really like. The knock on him is he's never won on American soil. I don't care about that at all. I think that's just totally subjective. And I know I just made a lot of subjective arguments, but that's just one thing personally I'm not going to account for. I think Snedeker is a guy. I've heard a couple really sharp people on him. I could easily see it. He's like the guy who's maybe not playing as well as everyone else, but could easily find it here at the Masters. He's great golfer. I think he could suit the course pretty well. Sergio, another one who just has great course history. Everyone else is like, Sergio will never win a major. He himself even said that he'll never win a major, so I guess that's concerning. But just great overall course history here, and a player that continuously shows up in majors. Patrick Reed has been super solid all year. He was solid at match play as well. I think he has a good streak of top tens going. He's just a guy that's going to always make the cut, and he's super solid. So I think there's reason to take Reed. I love Jimmy Walker at this course. And then the most interesting guy to me that I will probably be over-owned on versus other players is Koepka. Koepka, just the course fit here, I love. I think he's another bomber. I'm glad he missed the cut to a degree last week. Obviously, my bank account is not happy about that since I was all in on him. But in terms of Masters this week, I think that will drop his ownership percentage, the bad. Last round, so hopefully he'll be owned. And then Danny Willett is probably the most polarizing guy that I've heard people talk about in the industry. He's obviously playing really, really well overall. There's a stretch there where he was just so underpriced relative to how good of a golfer he is. And you could even make that argument now with the Masters relative to the pricing. Interesting, subjective kind of weird circumstance stuff you have to evaluate with Willett is he just had a baby. Some people are saying maybe he's not practicing as much because of that in the last couple of days. I have no idea. I'm definitely going to read more into him, but I've heard some people say he's an absolute must play in cash games. Like you have to have him. And then I've heard people say that, Danny Willett's their favorite fade of these low 8K guys. So, I think this range is very, very interesting. You could make a lot of arguments. The guy that I feel the most confident in relative to their price is probably Brooks Koepka. Colin, what do you think about 8 to 9K?
Well, finally we have something to disagree on. So, all right. So the ones I like really quickly, I think Koepka and Walker are probably my favorite in the price range just because they have the distance. And their metrics match up well. Oosthuizen is probably one of my least favorite plays in the whole tournament. And so I'll walk through how I got to that, and you could tell me what I'm missing here. So recent form alone, not only did he miss the cut last week, he was just in the bot. He just bombed out by a significant margin. So He has a blemish on his recent results. If you look at his course history and player models, how big I am on long-term form, there are basically 3 subpar making cuts on the Euro Tour and then 2 outright miscuts out of maybe the 8 international. So half of his international events where the competition is a lot lower, he was just really subpar. And I don't think a lot of people are pricing it in to his long-term form. So I can't get there to show maybe you write it off to injury or something like that because his back was flaring up and now it's magically fixed. But again, just from a results perspective, he has too many blemishes on his record, and I can't get there to make him a good play.
Sure.
Do you want to focus on that one? This is
Okay. Yeah. So Oosthuizen is a very interesting case, and this is, again, you can go into all the subjective stuff with Louis. Or do you want to finish up the rest of that tier, Colin, before I dive into Louis?
No, let's focus on Louis for now, because this is worth a deep dive, I think.
Okay. So Louis is just first of all, I have a slight bias towards Louis. I think Schwartzel, Louis, Rory have probably the sweetest swings in my opinion on tour, and Louis has been a guy who's really fought the back for the majority of his career. He's had to bring different mattresses to sleep on and had to do so many different things to get his back right. And he's talked openly about how he's had to withdraw and how he's made decisions on a Friday where he's just like, all right, I need to get out of here because of my back. And I'm not saying that happened last week, but he's a classic guy where he wasn't playing that well. And, I just saw him kind of give in. He had no problem leaving that course and heading to Georgia early. So in that regard, he's the guy that I might give a slight bump when I was talking about, the subjective decisions on guys I might value a little bit more in majors. If you look at his major history, just in general, he's played really well. I know the Masters is not the perfect fit for him, but he does have the driving distance when he needs it. That's, again, one of those super subjective things, but announcers talk about it all the time. And again, they're probably biased and probably wrong in some regards, but I do think there is some validity to it. In the match play, they're like, oh, Louis doesn't always rip it, but when he needs to, he can get that extra 20, 30 yards. And there's a drive where he really needed to bomb it, and he hit it like 330. And I think he's a guy that shows up in these spots. I don't love him, and you saying that you don't like him is probably going to make me lower him in my exposure more so than I originally would have, which is good. I like hearing why you like and dislike players, Colin, especially from a data perspective. But he's a very interesting case, and he's a classic guy who falls into all the subjective stuff just because of his injury history, I think.
Yeah, and I think injuries is always one of the biggest Achilles heel, maybe pun intended, of doing the data-driven decisions. But I'm trying to, but even it's I think everybody's tendency with injury is to discount a lot of past results and maybe be more aggressive in discounting those results than they quote unquote should. Because who's to say when it's truly fixed? Isn't his back still a risk for the Masters? How do you know if that has truly gone away?
Yeah, absolutely. He's a tournament play only for
me. Do you have a bearing on you probably have opinions on what his back is this week.
I think he's not going to give in.
Okay.
And that's where I would just give someone a slight bump, especially if you wanted to play him in in a high stakes tournament or something like that. Louis will not be on my cash game teams this week. I like him for tournaments. And I do think that this is a week.
Yeah, but
he'll take those extra precautions to make sure he's feeling better, and he will fight through. If his back did mess up a little bit, he might be more willing to fight through that in the Masters and play the whole round versus a normal tournament where there's a lot of risk where he'll just withdraw or just give in on Friday, whatever. And I think that has a little bit of value. Not a ton.
Yeah. Yeah, but even so, even with the amounts that you're talking about, it's still nowhere near to clear that threshold of I wouldn't even waste a GPP flyer on him, to be honest. I don't. Yeah, this is one of those we're far apart, and that's fine. I guess let the viewers decide. I guess So everyone else, I think what you said, Snedeker and Sergio, I guess they're kind of similarly grading out on the low end for me. I guess that's I haven't I maybe have to dive a little bit in their stuff, but I'm guessing it's for the same reasons. Just when in doubt, it's because there are too many bad long-term results. And just I don't see it. And how do I go about discounting that? Yeah. The idea alone of driving distance when you need it. Honestly, I would reflexively scoff at that kind of concept just because when do you not need driving distance?
Right.
Aside from laying up a hole, it's it's kind of always I could give it 30 yards for, but I'll pass this time. No, nobody makes that kind of besides laying up on a par 4 occasionally, but that just feels to me like an announcer contrived type of evaluation.
Oh yeah, the announcers are going wild about it. I was actually thinking about you at the match play and how you would think it was absolutely laughable. And I agree. I think overall it's probably overweighted, but there is something as an athlete. He has a pretty smooth swing in general. He gears it up. I played with a guy who played in college and was a state champion. Play a lot of golf myself, and he normally hits a 7-iron in Colorado 185 or so, 190, right? And I remember we were on a par 5 and it was like 205, slightly downhill. And he's like, oh, I'm just going to really rip this 7. And he had one of the best golf shots I've ever seen in person. He had this 205 yards, 7-iron within 5 feet of the hole. And I was just like, wow. He's like, what'd you do differently there? And he's like, well, I just geared up and I knew I had to take that much harder of a swing. And I think that might be something that Louis is capable of. So all guys technically could do that. And if they're consistently able to hit it farther, why aren't they doing it more often? I totally get that. But for Louis in particular,
right,
it might be a little bit more merit just because the back, like if he knows, every whatever stretch of time I'm going to throw out my back, especially if I'm swinging harder, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to take it easy. But if he needs that extra gear and he's feeling good, then maybe he can do it. I can buy into that a little bit more with that specific case versus other people.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
What do you think about 7 to 8K?
Yeah, let's get into that. So I have them pulled up right here, and I think it's going to be pretty chalky compared to what everyone else likes. I think everyone's going to be on JB Holmes. I think he's had great early line movement too. So even the markets kind of like him too. I think he has the distance to fit the course really well. So top guys are JB Holmes. Justin Thomas he's an interesting one because he's a first timer, and we haven't talked about first timers yet and how you approach them. I'd really like to hear your opinion on that. But from a pure stats perspective, he's grading out just fine. And I guess other guys like Matt Kuchar doesn't have the greatest course fit, and he's definitely discounted, but maybe discounted too much. And a similar thing with Paul Casey. So those are kind of my top guys in that kind of the mid range. Can we focus on Justin Thomas because we haven't talked about first timers at all yet?
Right. So in general, I'm going to fade first timers, and there's first timer hasn't ever won the Masters. Is that right? Spieth almost did it. I could be wrong on that statistic.
No, you're right. And actually, just a quick plug, Sean wrote a great article about this. Sean, one of our writers.
I need to read that. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, he wrote an article all about first-time golfers at the Masters. And I think actually it's going to surprise you a whole lot, Pete. So, yeah, check that out. Everyone check that out. But, yeah, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, just real quick, what was we don't want to spoil the article too much, but what was the conclusion of the article?
So the conclusion is even though they don't win it, they actually perform just as well as other golfers. Their adjusted rounds were actually a little bit lower on average than a lot of other guys in comparable positions. So even though they haven't won, that's kind of the famous thing that everyone listens to, but they're actually really good value for their respective prices and kind of where they are, especially in a salary cap league.
Really? So that's great. And in general, I have tried to avoid it in the past, and maybe that's something I'll adopt and totally change because it makes sense. The people, pricing how likely these guys are to win, they're going to definitely downgrade a lot of these guys who have never played here before with their prices. So they're automatically going to be cheaper, and they have better adjusted rounds. You need the winner on your team to win the Masters, but you still need, guys to place well. Top tens, and you can get some guys for really cheap prices that are great golfers. And Justin Thomas is certainly that, has a ton of distance. I've heard a lot of other people talk about him. He's been slightly polarizing and only because of the, first timer aspect of it, but for every other reason, he fits this course extremely well. And I probably have more shares of him now based on what I just learned. So that's interesting. Colin, what's your reaction to what Bryan just said?
Yeah, I believe there are first timers that in theory, that again, that's kind of my hypothetical, how well would you have to be playing and be a first timer for you to warrant consideration? In theory, you could have the prospect that just wins 5 tournaments, but has never played the Masters. And even Pete, I don't think even you would be well, he's never played before. So no. But I tend to, for what it's worth, I don't have the first timer effect weighted anywhere here. It's something that it's probably plays more heavily at Augusta just because I think Phil Mickelson was talking about you have to putt the greens from memory at some point, and there's only so much you can do without experience. But even from an ownership perspective, if I had to guess how that tilts it, I think maybe more people will shy away from first timers for reasons that aren't necessarily warranted. So I think I'd be more willing to take a flyer on first timers than most people.
Right. And I think that makes a lot of sense. to play devil's advocate, and what you hear all the time from players and other people is just, the greens, knowing the greens is so important, and knowing the subtleties and just some course management stuff that, they say it requires experience. But that's interesting. I'm really excited to read that article for Sean. Going through this range, I don't think JB Holmes is going to be as heavily owned as you think, which could be really nice. He was super heavily owned last year because he was coming in with just incredible form. But he is probably not going to be as heavily owned this week, I don't think, especially relative to last year.
Are we worried about the shoulder injury that took him out of the Open?
I think that there's a little bit of concern with that. I'll definitely want to hear more about it. But again, it's like one of those things where he's like, a lot of these guys are much more willing, especially on a Friday. If they know that they're not feeling great and that they're not in contention, they're very happy, especially an established player, just to get out of there and go down to Augusta and get prepping. So JB Holmes, withdrawing early, you see that a lot the week before the Masters, especially on Fridays there. So it's definitely a concern, but I want to read more about it. But in terms of ownership, I definitely don't think he's going to be heavily owned. I think he's an interesting play. I really like Zach Johnson as well, which goes against everything else I've been kind of saying in terms of guys. I'm going to target mostly guys with big driving distance, but I like Zach's current form. Really liked how he played at the match play. One thing that we didn't talk too much about, Colin, he was by far the best golfer when they were playing the first round, when you had to play kind of the round robin within your group. He was winning 6 and 5, 5 and 4, and he was just dropping dimes with his wedges. And he said he feels really good about his game, and he's won here before. And I think he could have a pretty nice round. He's not my favorite play. I probably won't have him in cash just because he's not going to make as many eagles and score as well in the par fives as these other guys, which I think is so important. But I do like him in this range. I think he's just a higher quality of golfer than his price. I like Justin Thomas. I like Bill Haas. I think these are all guys that people will be on. I like Paul Casey as well. And then someone who just consistently goes under-owned is Mark Leishman, and I like him quite a bit as well. He's at the higher end of the price range, but he's just a very, very solid golfer. And for tournaments, he's someone who has the upside for sure that is probably going to be somewhat low-owned. So this is a great range. This is where a lot of differentiation is going to come in, especially if you're trying to get some of these stars and you're going to need these guys in that 7K to 7-9 range. And it'll be interesting to see who people take. Lee Westwood was a guy I was looking at a little bit, but did not like what I saw last week. And he could be a guy where age is just really catching up on him, but he's historically played pretty well at Augusta.
Colin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things. I think so I'm looking at the guys you mentioned, like Leishman. He grades a little bit more. I think he's just too expensive. It's kind of nitpicking versus the $7,300 versus $7,900, but those $600 do make a difference from time to time. So I'm looking at his stuff. He grades a little bit too expensive, relative to some of those other guys, like Justin Thomas or even Harris English or Billy Horschel. If upside is admittedly one of the more difficult things to track because golf is so noisy to begin with, but I could buy into that for a tournament flyer. Zach Johnson is a similar thing where it's I don't know, maybe I don't see as many great recent results, and there's too many stuff in its long-term results that I'm just not too happy about. Pete, one of the things you didn't mention, for better or for worse, is the fact that he's a past Masters winner. And I was ready to theoretically jump on that because I guess the knock on that win was it was 45 degrees out, right? And once it gets that cold, it's just so skews everything that you basically aren't even allowed to count that for realistic out of sample purposes. Do you agree with that assessment of his course history?
It definitely is the most skewed one of the course histories because it just makes the par fives totally different, which is par five scoring is the whole key for this week, and or one of the big keys. It's not the whole key, obviously, but it's one of the really, really valuable things. And with that temperature, it just changes the way the whole course plays. So I don't think it matters nearly as much.
Yeah, but even still, if I'm nitpicking on Zach Johnson, I know there's too many miscuts in the last 4 months for me to it's maybe a subpar showing in Cadillac. I didn't see him in match play, so I don't know. Maybe you're picking up stuff there. But basically, the only thing that I can see writing on him is a top 5 finish in Arnold Palmer. But there are plenty of guys that have one-off like top 5 finishes that don't have anything else to back it up. So I don't know. I'm not seeing a whole lot. And again, the tiebreaker, not even tiebreaker, probably albatross around his neck is he just doesn't drive the ball all that far. And that's just, it rates out as that important for me. So I can't get there with Zach. I don't know.
Right. Okay. Well, let's dive into the bottom tier range. Who are you liking in the bottom tier, Colin?
Let's see. So let's pull up these bottom guys. So the ones that like I like a lot that I like, it's almost like disappointing because the secret got out because they had like a good showing last week, are Daniel Berger and Charlie Hoffman. I think they have a pretty good course fit anyway. I was probably going to pick them anyway before the results, and now since Berger's top 5 finish is not priced in into 6,200, I think he's just way too cheap for how well he's going to go. And again, he's a first timer, so apply your discounts accordingly. But I think I'm way more willing to take a flyer on a first timer, and I think he's probably one of I think he might be pretty highly owned, maybe a little bit better with Charlie Hoffman. And then the third guy, if you really want to get cheap, a guy that's kind of flying under the radar in my mind is Scott Piercy. He didn't play like recently, so no, I don't think he's going to be fresh in anybody's mind. But his recent string of results, like starting this year, I'm kind of pulling up his game log and player models. He only missed like one cut in the last the past 5-6 months. Like he has there's some decently hidden Euro results where like maybe people aren't factoring that in, but like he's had just a lot of solid finishes, driving the ball like pretty well recently. And I just think he's nobody's talking about him. So I think he's a good sub 6,000 play.
All right. Well, I think, and it's interesting because I've listened to a variety of things. I think you just named all the chalk, with the exception of one guy who I talked about Day being the most heavily owned. There's another guy that's going to be very heavily owned, and that's Ryan Moore. Ryan Moore, I think, is just way too cheap for his price, his current form. I think he sets up pretty well here, and I think he'll be really heavily owned at 6,800. You named the other guys that I think everyone's going to be all over. I think Charlie Hoffman's going to be pretty popular. I think Berger, I've heard a lot of people talking about him. He has the distance, and obviously the most recent, he's in good form. He had a top 5 finish. So I think a lot of people are going to be on him. One other person that I think I'm going to mention is Bryson DeChambeau. Obviously, he's never played here. He's an amateur, but he won the U.S. Amateur and the college the individual last year. He's a guy who's trying to really change golf, and he's a data-driven guy. Do you know much about him, Colin?
No, only that he's getting a lot of the hype train. All I hear is once in a generation prospect type of thing. I'm sure the upside is really there, but I just from a data perspective, until you have enough results that I can have something to go off of, I'm just never willing to take a flyer on that level of uncertainty. And I think with those pure prospect type guys, the amateurs, in DFS, I think more people are willing to jump on the upside and the prospectiness that isn't necessarily warranted. So I think a lot of he might be a little bit more over-owned, I think, for those same reasons that I'm just not willing to take a flyer on. But no, I don't know if he's a data-driven, if he's a money baller type guy. I know there are some guys that use that with great success, like Horschel. But no, I know nothing about his data tendencies.
Oh, he is the most interesting golfer on tour, hands down. All his irons are the exact same length, so no one else does that on tour. He just changes it, and he has this. He's obsessed with having this perfect geometrical swing that's on the same plane, and he's totally different than everyone else. The only club that's longer in his bag is the driver, and he's just attacks the game in a totally different way, and definitely bullish on the upside of him, especially bullish from a business standpoint. If I was endorser, I think, and I'm sure a lot of these companies are, he would be a big target for me because he just attacks the game in a totally different way, and he's all numbers oriented. Everything he does is based on data, and he's really attacking the game in a different way than everyone else on tour. So I think he's interesting, and it's fun to speculate on someone like him, which will probably boost his ownership relative to these other guys, but definitely an interesting option. And then one final comment pertaining to this range is that I've heard everyone be on the same guys. You mentioned Charlie Hoffman. He had great success there last year. Just played incredibly well this last week outside of Sunday, which was very peculiar. I probably won't weight it at all, but Sunday he could not hit a golf shot at all. His putting was just saving him. He was chipping in from out of bunkers, and he still had a horrible round. But he just completely lost his ball striking. But it's one day. It happens to everyone. I still really love him for this week. And he obviously is coming in on great form. The 3 previous days, he played amazing. And then in addition to that, you mentioned Piercy, who I've heard touted by some of the sharpest guys in the industry. And I think he's a really valuable play at 5,900 if you want to build a lineup with some really elite studs, especially if you want 2 of them. If you want to try to make a Rory Day lineup or something like that, you're going to absolutely have to have some really cheap guys in there. And Piercy, I think, is going to be really popular, and he should make the cut, which is what you want out of a 5,900 golfer. So I think we're on a similar page than a lot of these guys, and this bottom tier definitely is the tier where you can differentiate your lineup. If you have confidence, if you want to take like Angel Cabrera based on course history or whatever, any one of these guys that we didn't just name, if you have a good reason to like them, I think they're going to be really low owned relative to some of these other guys, and that could be a nice way to make your lineup a little bit more contrarian.
Pete, the only one I kind of want to nitpick out there is Ryan Moore, because you mentioned everybody's saying it's too cheap and stuff.
All over him.
I don't. Okay, it's like okay, good. Okay, I'll keep it simple. Ryan Moore has below average driving distance. Driving distance is really important at the Masters. What am I missing?
I think everyone just values his current form and his long-term form relative to his price. I think that he's a guy who's just a much better golfer than where he's priced at. And I think that's the only reason for it. But he is almost every podcast or article that I read, everyone identifies him as the value cheap guy, which I think there's merit to that, but definitely understand the data that he doesn't fit the course as well.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's the one where I kind of disagree. So I look at his 2016 results. It's basically, it's polarized for sure. It's like, it's 3 top 10 finishes, a missed cut, and a last of the made cuts. So basically very up and down. So maybe from a tournament flyer, I get it, where it's okay, if you sold me on upside for recent form, then maybe I'd buy in. I think his form is more complicated when you have 2 out of 5 results are 2 out of 6. 2 out of 5 results are bad. And then the X factor is his driving distance is just that low. And I get that his overall game, you can say is too cheap, but if you look at what's what makes him so good, I think he tops out in driving accuracy, and that's why he's so good. But that just doesn't matter at the Masters. So I just think his course fit is that bad that maybe everybody's touting more. I'll go against the world on this one. I hard disagree.
Awesome. Well, that's a great take and great for tournaments, because he is a guy that's going to be pretty heavily owned. I think maybe not nearly as owned as Day. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I've just heard a couple people that are really big on Ryan Moore. I think he's a top 40 golfer in the world, and he's down there in price. So that
right. Well, maybe that's what. Yeah, maybe that's what's driving it. Honestly, actually, this is a question for you. How many people look at OWGR ranking per dollar or whatever as a measure? Because I get it in theory, but I had the same beef when I was doing my tennis stuff. The ATP rankings aren't predictive. Neither is OWGR. I think it's honestly kind of a lazy shortcut if you're trying to predict the next tournament. So maybe that's what's driving where everybody's hyped about him. But I don't know, you unpack the numbers somewhere between OWGR isn't that predictive and he has a bad course fit. I don't know. It's my spidey sense says I'm seeing something that everyone else isn't, and I'm wondering what am I missing. But I don't know. Again, Ryan Moore is a guy where I can't get there.
I love it because it makes it a good reason to fade him. And I don't think there's a huge amount of argument. I don't think people in general are rating where someone's rated in the world to dollars per whatever their ranking is. But I do think when you're identifying these guys down, especially when you're in the cheaper tiers, that's where people start to value, okay, this guy's just too good of a golfer relative to his price. And I think that's what's kind of happening with Ryan Moore, especially when you compare him to some of these other guys. I mean, it's much easier to get behind him than, say, a Hunter Mahan or, even like Ernie Els and some of these other guys that are in this range. But, yeah, I think that's interesting. I'm going to have to look at him a lot more, and I'm very curious to see if, some of these other people, I'm excited to see some of the content come out, how bullish they are on Ryan Moore, because I've heard a couple people really endorse him.
Cool. Okay. All right. Yeah. Any more words on that last tier, or are we good to move on?
Good to move on.
Yeah.
Cool. So before we end it, I do kind of just want to jump in real quick. Obviously, we have a lot of big tournaments on DraftKings this week. The Millie Maker, and all sort of, tournaments at different price points, whether you want to put in just a couple bucks or a little bit more. And obviously the Millie Maker is a massive tournament with lots of people. We have a Millie Maker for NFL, and we did that a lot in NFL season at DraftKings, and FanDuel had one as well. Pete, do you have any, maybe it's just some strategy for beginners, people who are entering the Millie Maker, other than just you're going to have to try to be contrarian to win it?
I think contrarian's really important, and I think you'll hear this from a lot of other people too, but it's so critical in these millionaire makers and just in general. Really try to build a core and build around that. Even if you're entering 100 lineups, people think they can cover so many combinations and get exposure to so many guys. And trust me, when you try to cover a lot of combos, you're gonna get off the guys you really like, and it just doesn't work. So what I would recommend to anyone, whether you're building 5 lineups, 10 lineups, 100. I think it's really important to identify your absolute favorite plays and build around your core. And you can differentiate a contrarian lineup too with one guy or 2 guys, and then you go all chalk on the rest. You don't have to have 6 contrarian guys to win it. So from a roster construction standpoint, just realize, okay, I have these great chalky plays that I really love that are part of my core or whatever. I'm going to differentiate at this one spot, and you can still have a really nice, unique lineup. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and I think this is truly one of the best DFS tournaments out there.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add in some a little bit of advice before we leave. Yeah, I agree with that. You be chalk in a lot of areas. The point of being contrarian is to create a unique lineup that still has upside, not to take bad golfers or not to take bad plays just because it gives you a chance. You could take chalk and then take one guy who's going to be contrarian, and that could create a unique lineup for you. And a unique lineup is what wins, not a unique golfer. Be mindful of that for sure. Cool. So we will end it there. Just a couple quick notes. We have a lot of great content on the site. We mentioned Sean's rookie article. He also wrote a course article. We have a bunch more coming tomorrow. Colin continued, I think finished his diatribe against strokes gained this afternoon. And all sort of great content. So please.
I am finally done. Nobody is more happy than me to stop writing about it. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds great. So please go read that. There's a lot of great articles. We'll have a lot more tomorrow, obviously, and we're going to have that live show at 8:30 Eastern Time tomorrow night. Tomorrow being Wednesday, where we're going to answer questions, kind of go through. We'll add Sean in on that, the guy who wrote that rookie article. So you can ask him more about that, Pete, then, and we'll have a good show. So come listen to that, and we'll tweet more information on that tomorrow. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. It's Masters Week. It's exciting. So we'll talk to you guys tomorrow.